I'm speaking here with Loriliai Biernacki, and we'll be talking about a number of things, many of which will be related to her recent book, which I'll show here in case anybody's watching the video, The Matter of Wonder, Abhinavagupta's Panentheism and the New Materialism. So lots of interesting topics that I'm looking forward to exploring with you from that. And also you sent me some articles on integration information theory, I think.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, which had some really interesting ideas in it. So hopefully we'll get a chance to go through that as well. But before we dive in, I'm curious, what is your background? What led you to want to focus particularly on Abhinavagupta?
I did my undergraduate at Princeton, and I did it in English literature. And then after I finished, I went to California, and I had this idea that I was going to try to find a guru and get enlightened. But anyway, I did sort of did find a guru, and then I got very interested in Sanskrit, and then I went to Penn for graduate school, and then I studied. My advisor was Wilhelm Holtfass, who actually is a philosopher. So it was a good match. But I initially went thinking I was going to study ritual, and then but then due to as the fates arranged things, and I was in the religious studies department, I wound up managing to have the good fortune of being able to switch to Holtfass, who was he was brilliant, brilliant thinker, and so he was the one who actually, at a certain point, he said to me, I was in a class with him, and he's like, there's this thinker, Abhinavagupta. Why don't you read some of him, see what you think? And so he sort of prodded me into starting to study him. And then once, as you know, because you've read some Abhinava, once you read him, especially in the Sanskrit, it's just entrancing. He's a wonderful writer. I mean, and he's just a really wonderful writer, and he's funny sometimes. He's very deep. He's just a good writer. I mean, compared to say Shankara, I think Abhinava is he's a much nicer writer. He's just much more fun to read. In terms as a writer, he's just I like him a lot better as a writer. He's not as pedantic. He's just a really good writer as well, and. So then and then it was my advisor Holtfass as well who said, there's this text, that hasn't been translated yet. Why don't you sort of look at this particular text? And his idea was you can write on samavesha, which is this key concept in Tantra, which is this notion of a person sort of getting possessed by a deity. Now, the Pratyabhijna, this particular school of philosophy with Abhinavagupta and his predecessors Utpaladeva, one of the things that they do is they actually tend to sort of transform that notion into instead of being this crazy wild, and Alexis Sanderson talks about this, instead of being this crazy wild idea of a person getting possessed by a deity, which do we have that in our world? Maybe parts of South America, I don't know. What happens with this particular Pratyabhijna is they actually sort of shift the idea so that it's not some external wild thing possessing you. It's a sense of entering into this sort of greater understanding of Shiva. And that becomes this sort of so Sanderson says that the tradition becomes sanitized. Okay, and the idea there is that what happens is that it becomes more philosophical. It becomes more of a philosophical tradition rather than a sort of theurgic or wild sort of phenomenological sort of mystical experience. Now, I don't think it's entirely the case that it when it shifts to this sort of philosophical perspective, that it loses the very profound, intense, mystical components of it. I don't think that happened with these thinkers. But what it does do is it sort of requires a sort of reworking of ontology on a very deep level, I think. And so that's where you start to get, Abhinava's brilliant sort of non-dualism, his Advaita Tantra, as opposed to Advaita Vedanta. I'm going.
No, it's fantastic. I mean, I have to just first of all say, what a blessing to have been able to study with Holtfass. I mean, that is, I imagine it was probably close to the end of his career, right? Because he's passed away now, and for those that are listening, he is was a trailblazing kind of thinker, and the fact that you were able to study with him, I mean, I'm jealous.
Yeah, he was. Actually, I got this job here at Colorado. That was my, I just finished my dissertation, got the job here at University of Colorado Boulder, and I had intended in my, my first year here in the spring. I had intended. I was talking with him. I was like, "Oh, why don't you come and give a talk here?" And he passed before he was able to come, which was very, very sad. So I was, it was like I had just sort of gotten here, and then he was gone.
That's really sad. Yeah. If anybody is not familiar with his work and you're interested in Indian philosophy, check it out.
I should say also, I did not actually intend to become a philosopher, though. I mean, I had his philosophical influence, and I guess like many people, I just like to think about ideas. But I did not actually ever intend to go into philosophy because I had this stereotype of philosophy as being like, just mincing of words, and especially with analytic philosophy, and it's kind of BS. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but that was this sort of,
So you were probably most interacting with like analytic philosophy, where there's less interest in kind of meaning and the human experience, and more with like logic chopping.
That's right. Yeah, there's a person, who really I didn't really have training in philosophy apart from working with a philosopher, Halpfas, and there were these sort of stereotypes I had of that, that really a lot of philosophers actually just sort of find fancy ways of expressing their sort of their belief systems. Maybe even based on psychological sort of histories that they had as well. Yeah. Also, so okay, but yeah, so I didn't really start out to be a philosopher at all, and it's just that I think that a lot of us, right? We just sort of, you can't help think about the meaning of life. And so if that's philosophy, then,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I studied continental philosophy. I was always attracted to more of the kind of 20th century, the phenomenologists and the existentialists and these kind of people who were reflecting on the human experience. So, and I was, and a lot of people who studied continental philosophy, there's this huge kind of argument and debate between or rivalry between these two traditions of thought. And, we just sneered at these, analytic philosophers as being just totally narrow-minded about the possibilities of what philosophy can do. Yeah.
No, I mean, I definitely have been sort of, my own perspective around what philosophy and what it is and what it can do has been broadened by colleagues. I mean, even when I was writing this book, I pitched it towards religious studies scholars, and also I wanted to reach a wider audience with this. But people like Michael Allen, who's really, I don't know if you know Michael Allen's work. He's at the University of Pennsylvania. He's you should have him on your podcast. Okay. He's actually he works with vernacular sources of Vedanta. He's a really good thinker, and he started a group at the American Academy of Religion. Centered around Hindu philosophy, which we hadn't had, which is bizarre because there was Buddhist philosophy groups, continental philosophy, every philosophy you can think of, but not Hindu philosophy. But he's really quite a good thinker, and he's thinking a lot about these ideas of broadening the notion of philosophy so that's not just an analytic category, which is really parochial, as a number of people, I think, maybe people even like, I think even maybe Gennard and Gennari has said something like this as well too. This sort of strain of philosophy which is dominant in the U.S. right now is really rather parochial.
Yeah.
But you will know more about that than I will, I'm sure.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because I see your work as really carving out a space, an intersection between kind of various sort of maybe specializations, disciplines, in a way that's really interesting because. In some sense, because you can approach this stuff from sort of the religious studies angle, you can approach it from the philological angle, you can approach it from the philosophical angle. And the problem with philosophy, at least, with most of its institutionalization, is that it is generally, it has, its canon, it has its sort of, problems and the discourses around those problems. And it's pretty narrow in its ability to kind of welcome new thinkers and actually interact with thinkers outside the Western canon. So that becomes an obstacle. And then, religious studies has its own problem, sort of. I mean, perhaps you disagree. I was never in religious studies, but it seems like from that desire to create a sort of objectivist discourse outside of theology, then religious studies is, resistant towards embracing kinds of non-discursive epistemologies. And it feels like, to me, like you can actually, someone said this to me once, it wasn't my idea, that actually philosophy can embrace, perhaps, depending on the, the school and the philosopher, can embrace something like, a meditation practice, because they can conceive it as something like a form of a thought experiment. So you don't have to necessarily categorize it in this sort of, this is a religious practice, right? This is a practice of that is, a ritual that's based in sort of belief and doctrine and dogma, and therefore it is outside sort of the parameters of what we're permitted to interact with academically.
I mean, I think that religious studies has a little bit of that, but really less than you would think. And I think, part of this is due to sort of, wonderful thinkers like Jeff Kripal.
Yes, I have. I love Jeff Kripal. He's great.
Yeah. And so Jeff's work is really phenomenal, because he's actually sort of, he is looking back to people like William James, the founding of our quote discipline, right? But he's also, he's trying to sort of put back on the table all of these things that have been pushed off in this attempt to sort of like, not be theological, or else be very theological and not be doing religious studies as well. So religious studies, I think, has a bigger open space for this. And I think a lot of this is being spearheaded by somebody like Jeff, not by Jeff in particular. I think Jeff is actually sort of like making it possible for us. I mean, even though Jeff's not really talking about Indian philosophy or these sorts of things, I think he's just sort of making it possible for us to sort of really look at, things that are happening in religious traditions in ways that are allowing us to think about them in comparative context with what we know in our own world. So I think his work is actually crucial in sort of what you're pointing to, is this sort of, the possibilities for us to actually start thinking differently about ancient philosophers, medieval philosophers, and connecting them to sort of things that are happening and possible in our world. As you know, in the book, I talk a lot about things like AI, notions of information, and it's because they're relevant. Like what Abhinavagupta has to say about this is relevant, and it's true. It would be very difficult. It is true that it has been difficult to do things like that. But I think there is a sort of movement afoot to sort of like allow us to sort of think about life, and and also to think about these ideas outside of our silos. And I do attribute a lot of that to Jeff. Actually, I think he's done some amazing sort of groundbreaking work to make this possible.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean, in some sense, of course, the work of Abhinavagupta can be understood from a theological point of view. Of course, I mean, it's appropriate to refer to it that way, but also there's a sense in which the practice and the system of thought is also trying to say something about reality itself, and the mechanism, the contemplative technologies are means by which we actually cultivate knowledge. And you don't necessarily have to read that in a kind of, there's just problems with that categorization as theological, because it sort of puts it over there rather than it actually as something, which I think you do really beautifully in your book, especially with regards to the kind of the idea of the subtle body, and like talking about the deities as, these multiple personalities within us, that is actually saying something true about our experience of embodiment and the various, you speak a lot about biological intersections of various sorts. And so, so I guess I want to talk a little bit about wonder first to get us kind of in the ballpark of this, diving deeper into what you explored in your book. So, the book is about wonder. And again, I mentioned you talk a lot about biology, and you bring into the sciences while dancing really, elegantly between these different systems of thought. And what I think on the face of it will seem rather either really hard to conceptualize or perhaps absurd if you're indoctrinated by our materialist worldview, is this idea of matter as wonder, right? That actually, because people think of wonder as something that's an epiphenomenal property of our mind. It's an internal kind of mental experience, and then there's matter over there. So just to get it down to kind of the basics of that distinction between matter as we understand it and the modern world, and matter as it's being kind of explored in Abhinavagupta, what is that that big distinction.
Abhinava makes a really brilliant move, okay? Because, just as, to bring it down to the basics, we have a problem with what we call, what Chalmers dubbed the hard problem, okay? The mind, the mind-body gap, so we have this problem in our world. Abhinavagupta's world had the same problem. Okay, so they also had this problem of how do you connect consciousness to materiality. And as you can see with Sankhya is similar in a lot of ways. It's not the same, but it's quite similar to Descartes' notion of the res cogitans and res extensa, and so you do find this problem in Indian philosophy as well. And when Abhinava comes up with this notion of wonder and connected to Vimarsha, which is its material basis, what he's doing is he's actually sort of allowing his philosophical tradition to solve the problem of the mind-body gap. Like, that's the impetus for what he's doing. And how does he do it? What he does is he actually sort of, and I love the way he does this, because what he does is he actually sort of uses a phenomenological lens to reconstruct the notion of wonder, to allow us to recognize that wonder is always embodied, and it has to be embodied. And then so he draws from this sort of like basic phenomenological insight. And so, as you saw in the book, I talk a lot about the experience of wonder. We think it's a transcendence up and out. And what Abhinava does is he actually sort of shows us how wonder itself is actually a sort of inward into the materiality of what we are. And so, and I mean, the why he does that is that ultimately he has to do that if he wants to have a non-dualism that will sort of not either push, say, matter is an illusion, which is what we find in, say, Advaita Vedanta, or that, as someone like Daniel Dennett says today, that consciousness is an illusion when he calls it an epiphenomenon. So Abhinava found a way to sort of like navigate these two, and the way that he does it is that he uses phenomenology to sort of then connect this idea of the will and this idea of the experience of something like wonder. He connects it back to the idea of the body, to the idea of the breath, to the idea of materiality. And so that's the sort of the I would say it's a fantastic, amazing sort of brilliant insight that he has, and that and it's something that we today really haven't quite been able to get either. So that's one of the reasons I say in the book and in other articles I've written that we can actually use some of his ideas to help us get through some of our own philosophical conundrums as well. That and it's good because he's coming from a sort of primarily from a phenomenological perspective. When he's a very deep thinker, but he's also, as you know and have pointed out, I think that he's also something of he's a meditator and enlightened. The tradition says he was enlightened, and he is definitely very deep as a thinker, and it's clear he's very aware of like the mind and how the mind works, and so. And that's one of the things I do love about his writing as well, also, that he's got a wonderful sort of awareness of like what it is that the mind does, how the mind works, this sort of thing. And so he's using phenomenology to help us sort of reappraise what consciousness is, and bringing it back to this notion that consciousness is not this thing that's separate from materiality. Yeah. And that gets structured in his you could call it a dual aspect non-dualism, that he's got these two elements, which is these two elements, one of which is knowledge, and the other which is kriya, action, jnana and kriya, which you then transcribe onto prakasha and vimarsha. Prakasha means light, okay? This sort of and vimarsha. And this is the key thing that he does. Vimarsha means this, it becomes this, I translate it as active awareness. And I use the word active there because it connects to this notion of kriya. And then with this, he connects it to materiality and the world. So how do you get sentience? How do you get what we think of as consciousness? You get it from vimarsha, from materiality and the world. And he does that through this notion of subjectivity, ahanta, I-ness. The only other contemporary Western thinker, I think, who sort of gets this on a deeper level is actually she passed away. Did you ever read any of Lynn Rutter Baker's work? She's really quite
So,
brilliant. She's a philosopher. She's a philosopher, and reading her work, I realized like, oh, she actually is it's not quite the same as what Abhinav is saying, obviously, for many reasons, but she actually gets some of this idea of this notion of why consciousness has to be consciousness as we think of it in the Western world has to be sort of in a particular perspective based on an I-ness within a material body. And this is also why Abhinav says this over and over in various different places, this notion that the highest divinity has a body, the body of the highest divinity is the universe. So you can't get, with his thinking, what you don't get is a place of, quote, pure consciousness separated from materiality, because consciousness itself is always sort of the first person perspective is instantiated. That's the idea here.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Throughout the book, it's clear that the motivation, so to back up a little bit, many people, when they kind of encounter Abhinavagupta's work, it's one of the sort of basic ideas that people encounter is this idea that consciousness is primary, right? And in my experience, there's been a lot of seeming potential misunderstandings of thinking that that's just kind of a form of idealism, right? That it's kind of just almost like a solipsistic, a new solipsism in a way. And when you dive a little deeper, as you say, you discover that there is no separation between consciousness and matter in this tradition. So you elected to kind of focus on the matter side of the question, and it's a very, very apparent from your book that you did that for reasons, kind of political reasons. I mean, reasons with regards to like how we're thinking about matter culturally, and how this new new approach, it's actually quite old, but perhaps new for us, approach to matter really kind of overturns and resolves a lot of conflicts that actually emerge in our own intellectual tradition, the West, our own intellectual tradition. So I'm curious, can you outline a few of the kind of reasons, the few of the kind of misunderstandings that are sort of pervasive in European and English-speaking thought before they encounter a thinker like Abhinavagupta?
You mean in terms of going back to, say, a Cartesian conception of...
Yeah. I mean, throughout, obviously, there's so many points that you make throughout the book with regards to this, but there's some... let's actually approach it with regards to this new materialism. Actually, that's probably be better because you cite a number of thinkers that are proposing this kind of new materialism. Jane Bennett, who I actually read years ago, and they're doing doing something really interesting and kind of radical by introducing this kind of new, seems like a kind of a new animism, but they don't make it all the way. It seems like Abhinavagupta, in your view, provides a picture that actually resolves some of the contradictions or issues that emerged in these other thinkers. So can you walk us through that a little?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's I think Bennett and maybe Mary Jane Rubenstein as well. Both sort of Rubenstein's talking more about pantheism, I think, and not as much not as directly about new materialism in this section, although I think Rubenstein did do an edited volume I'm in that volume on new materialism and science as well. So she's keenly aware of these ideas as well also, and I think that, and she talks about Spinoza and there's in the book I talk a little about this idea that Spinoza doesn't go quite as far as Abhinavagupta does to sort of recognize this notion of consciousness in matter, really in matter. But one of the things I think that's actually really, really important and is this, and that is the reason why European philosophers don't go whole hog on this is because there's really only one way you can go whole hog on it and not run into major problems, and that is if you take a position say like Spinoza, or let me not think of Spinoza here. And I'm not a Spinoza expert.
I love
by any
Spinoza,
stretch.
but it's been years since I read him.
Oh, well, maybe you can sort of. Well, you can sort of.
I've forgotten the details, but I know the basics.
And that is, you have to have really an Advaita Vedanta approach, and then the world becomes an illusion. And so what's so key about what Abhinava does is it has to do with this idea of Vimarsha, and that is that he basically wants to keep the world. He doesn't want to have the world be an illusion, okay? And what we do know is that if you say that, and a lot of contemporary, like Christoph Koch does this a little bit, I think, the computer scientist who's aligned himself with Tononi in integrated information theory, and other scientists will do this. They'll sort of embrace. It's impossible to get from matter to consciousness. The brain can't produce it because it just doesn't make any sense. And so I'm walking back these things, but it'll come through. And then someone like Bernardo Kastrup actually sort of says, well, let's take this to its logical conclusion. We have to have Advaita Vedanta. That's it. We just have to have completely Advaita Vedanta, an idealism. We find idealism in the West. I think Berkeley and other philosophers as well. And that's really where you have to go. But what Abhinava is saying here is that you don't actually have to go there, because Abhinava wants to keep the world. But it is the case that what we see in our world is that people, consciousness, there's some things we think of as being conscious and some things there's not. And there is a distinction. My pen, I can throw it across the room. It's not a problem. I don't think it's sentient. Your dog, not so much. Okay. Because we have this idea that some things are sentient and some things are not. And an idealism, panpsychism or proto-panpsychism doesn't really know how to solve that problem. And that's what Abhinava is focusing on in much of his work. He's focused on this particular problem of there are some things that we understand to be sentient and other things that not. Now, he also, because it's a non-dualism, he also has to say that ultimately everything is sentient consciousness, or he doesn't say that. He says everything has the capacity for consciousness and for sentience. He does sort of, even in his writing, he does make distinctions. He does, so you'll find this sort of standard Sanskrit phrase, Brahmadi Stamba Pariyantam, which means that, this whole creation from, Brahma all the way down to plants. And Abhinavagupta doesn't go to plants. He says, Brahmadi Kitantam. Which he stops at insects and worms, okay? So what you have here is this notion that everything has, and for Abhinava, it's hidden at the base and the core of things, has this capacity for sentience and consciousness. And that's because of Vimarsha, or it's because of the nature of consciousness being all pervasive. But if it gets covered over, hidden over, then you can make distinctions between a pen, a cup, and a person. And I think that is the key idea that Abhinava brings that you don't really find in a lot of Western philosophy. That Western philosophers, they get stumped at this particular juncture. Either you have to go into sort of, I'm going to go whole hog, and like Berkeley, or nowadays Bernardo Kastrup, and say everything it's all mind. There's nothing else. And in some ways, I don't think it's. I think you could take an idealism and you can understand Abhinava's sort of philosophy in through a lens that is idealistic in some respects, but Abhinava does not want to do that. And it's true that but I think you can read him at some points as being somewhat idealistic. And you're right. When I wrote the book, it's true that many previous interpreters of Abhinava have sort of leaned towards this the idealism and this idealistic perspective, and that's one of the reasons why you see so many, you see a lot of emphasis on prakasha, this idea of light. But what a lot of these folks haven't really sort of pointed out is that it's very clear that Abhinava does understand prakasha, the idea of light, as being connected to the notion of being an object, so lacking this notion of sentience. So he does this wonderful switch which I talk about in much more detail in the fourth chapter, in the chapter where I talk about can computers become sentient in the book. And it's really a brilliant insight that he has, and it's a brilliant move that he makes in order to demonstrate this, to sort of to not only to link matter and consciousness, mind and body, but also to sort of it's like a Mobius strip insofar as that he actually cross-links them in ways that we have in the West we just haven't done. Like we think consciousness and in matter, not just from Descartes, but even before Descartes, there's this consciousness, there's matter, and then we don't really sort of link the two together. And that's what Abhinava is able to do by understanding that matter has consciousness, but not in this sort of facile proto-panpsychist way that we see a lot of contemporary thinkers doing. He does it in a way where he recognizes that you absolutely have to bring in the this notion, what he calls ahanta, which is I-ness. You have to bring in subjectivity. So I think so I've written a little bit about Tononi and his integrated information theory, and one of the articles that I wrote about this theory is I basically said, look, you guys are talking about subjectivity, and then they did actually a year or so after that, they actually started fessing up and saying, yeah, we're actually talking about subjectivity. So I think it's so I think that they also realize that you cannot get you cannot have consciousness in a panpsychist way without you need a notion like this idea of subjectivity instantiated in materiality, if you want to get the kinds of this idea of consciousness where we think about it. I mean, as you know, in the book, I also talk quite a lot about this, the fact that, we're very sloppy in our terminology when we say consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, it's sort of like, well, what do we actually mean by consciousness? And I think that's sort of what Abhinava recognizes as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sometimes I like to make a distinction between consciousness and awareness, right? Awareness as being sort of our individuated, what we would typically associate with being conscious, at least in our current cultural paradigm. That's really interesting. So do you want to go a little deeper maybe? Because a lot of these, ideas will probably be new to a lot of the people listening. So do you want to kind of give us a brief primer of the integration information theory and maybe give us a little more context into how that is, how that's become interesting to you in your work and why you feel it is so resonant with a conversation with Abhinavagupta?
Yeah, I mean, not just my work. A lot of, I think it's one of the leading theories for consciousness in philosophy of mind, and these these people are they're working on neurology. The Tononi is a neurologist, a neurophysicist. He's working on the brain, etc. And he actually came up with a theory. And what he recognized right away was, he went back to Descartes, because what he recognized right away is that consciousness is the elephant in the room, and all of our current science is, trying to get consciousness out of our brain, and they're not getting anywhere. And so what he said was like, what we have to do is go back to Descartes and recognize that what's the one thing we know? The one thing we know is our awareness. I'm going to use the word awareness. What word would you use for awareness in a Sanskrit context? Because often the word bodha is used for awareness. I don't know if you have any other words in mind. When you think? No,
I guess, perhaps the manas would be or like the antakarana in general, like that sort of faculty that is kind of facilitating the individuated processing of experience.
Yeah. That's great because, like in Sankhya, the antakarana is actually not conscious.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's where we get in trouble. Yeah. Yeah. And I think also, that's a good question about actual Sanskrit kind of corollaries because, usually it's sort of like because when I just throw out their consciousness, it is to just people that I'm having a conversation with who perhaps have never been introduced to this line of thinking. They're like, well, why do you want to call something that is otherwise material, why do you want to use consciousness to describe that? It's like they don't understand the stakes behind that, because to me there's embracing our material and cognitive experiences as expressions of consciousness has a sort of, there's an implication that means that we can actually, inhabit through our whatever faculties, various other entities, objects, and so seeing how subjectivity goes all the way down provides this ability for us to understand that, like, we don't stop, right, with this physical body mind, that we're not just this, right, which is of course what ultimately the non-dualists want us to understand, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I also have been thinking a lot about this, even since, I mean, I do sort of bring this up a little bit in the book, in like the 5th chapter, where I talk about models for consciousness. And I say, like, well, maybe we can think about it in terms of what this Berit Brogard talks about as a kind of like she's talking about these, she's saying the field of gravity, and she comes up with this term mentons. And I'm saying, well, maybe we can understand Abhinavagupta a little bit like that. And I think also even someone like Bernardo Kastrup is actually thinking more in terms of waves and fields. I mean, why am I bringing this up? Because I'm going back to this notion of, like, panpsychism and, proto-panpsychism, and what that derives, I think, or is closely tied to a lot of contemporary thinking about quantum physics and quantum mechanics. And so how do you get consciousness, how do you get consciousness out of, quantum events? And so I think there's been a direction towards understanding consciousness vis-a-vis these notions of quantum mechanics. And I think some people are sort of bringing up this idea, well, we got to think about it in terms of waves. Okay. Now, and one of the things that I think is so interesting and peculiar about consciousness is that, I mean, I'm if you've been with a person in a relationship for a while, what you start to notice is that they're constantly reading your mind, or you're reading their mind, people are, and so then when you think about that in relationship to ideas of consciousness, like, how is it that, my thoughts can be read by another person who's sitting next to me, and there are also all sorts of like, and Jeff Kripal talks a lot about this too, like these anomalous things that we need to bring back on the table. Psychics, people who can read other people's minds, and the idea is that you get some sort of veridical test. Now, obviously, I'm not working on any of these sorts of things, but it's too obvious to notice how many times another person is reading your mind, or you're reading another person's mind. Usually, it's someone who you're close to. But what does that do? It makes me think about, like, what is the nature of consciousness then? If it's such a thing that can be transmitted without words to another person, because we, so we think of, okay, so I'm talking here now about something I talk about in the 5th chapter of the book, which is this notion of information, and how does, and I'll bring this back too as well to sort of to Noni and what they talk about in terms of information. So how is it that we actually ever communicate? We have this idea that I'm saying words, they're coming from me, you pick up on the words, and then you sort of process them in your own sort of, computer in your brain, whatever. And then, and it says this piece of information relayed through sort of sound, etc., into this other person's processing machinery, whatever. Now this, I'm obviously, using this sort of really awful stereotype of the brain as a computer here. But I mean, that's sort of our model, but then you come up with these things like, you're sitting there and you're like, you get the phone rings and you know exactly who it is, and so these little things that happen make us want to think of consciousness in a different way. Okay. And I think that Abhinava is already doing that as well also. And that's why these, and not just the Advaita Tantrists like Abhinavagupta and the Pratyabhijna, but also these other, even the Advaita Vedantins, they're trying to sort of say, look, consciousness it's not like these discrete things that you pass from one person to another. We have to have a different model of the nature of consciousness as well. So I like this idea that you're saying, okay, if you say awareness, okay, Bodha, what is awareness? How does awareness, go from one person to another person? It's true, the Antakarana, you brought up, the Antakarana, and the thing about the Antakarana, which is, I think, partly why it gets slotted in the sort of category of the insentient, is because it's understood as these discrete sort of, it's this discrete thing that is connected. It evolves out of, of course, it evolves out of, Prakriti, right? This Antakarana is, the buddhi, the intellect comes out, and then ego, and then ahamkara, and then manas, the mind. And so, but these things become discrete and sort of particularized when they sort of are located within a particular individual, the purusha. But that is not the same thing as consciousness, and I think that that's why even Sankhya, which is where we first get this theory of concretizing the will as something insentient, concretizing the intellect as something insentient, concretizing the mind as something insentient in Sankhya, it's precisely because they're sort of concretized in this sort of scheme. Whereas consciousness itself is something that's actually, is it a wave? I don't know. But awareness is like that. Bodha awareness is like that. So these are all things that and as you know, with the work that I've done here, what I'm really trying to do is get at what are the models that we're using and what models will actually work. And this is another reason why I think Jeff Kripal's work is so important, because he's sort of like bringing these other things that happen onto the stage, so that we actually need to sort of incorporate them in the models that we come up with. So I know that you had mentioned to me earlier that you also interviewed Rupert Sheldrake as well, and that he was talking about this idea of, I read an article of his where he was talking about that maybe we should consider that the sun itself is conscious, is sentient. Now, so to bring this back to, you're asking about contemporary IIT, integrated information theory, that would be a complete no for contemporary neuroscience, IIT, integrated information theory. And that's because they have this axiom, this fifth axiom, which basically says that, things like cities are not conscious, and things like this, vaster, the galaxy is not conscious, the sun is not conscious, our solar system is not a conscious entity, that there's a cutoff limit there, and the cutoff limit has to do, partly with, the granularity of it, the grain, but also the cutoff has to do with, they talk about in terms of like maximal amount of phi, okay? That is this capacity for, I think this would have to be a much longer conversation. Right?
What is phi in one sentence?
Yeah, in one sentence, phi is basically it's a number. It's a way to generate a number that will that tells you how much consciousness something has, whether it's a person or a computer or a photodiode. So one of the things they say is that, it's very useful. They use it they use it for like patients who are in a coma. If a patient's in a coma, and if you can measure the activity in the brain, and it measures basically the amount of recursivity that occurs. Okay, and again, what I like about that is this idea of recursivity, which is exactly what Abhinavagupta is talking about when he uses this word vimarsha. It's a kind of reflective, recursive capacity. And so this contemporary neuroscience theory actually sort of has caught on to this notion as well also. Okay, so you have this idea of this recursivity, and then you get this, and they've discovered a way to sort of like quantify it, measure the amount of recursivity, and then you can sort of say whether or not something is conscious, i.e. sentient. Really, sentient is what they're talking about here, having subjectivity based on how high a score they get on this capacity for phi. This is a capacity for recursive thinking. Okay, and so and it's actually quite refreshing, because one of the things they say that look, your computer, your iPhone is not conscious. It's not going to be conscious. It's got the wrong kind of processing. It doesn't have a capacity to have a recursive, reflective processing where it goes back and reflects on its own reality and then takes a new choice. And Abhinav talks about the same thing. The very idea of freedom has to do with this capacity to sort of to reflect and then create something which is based on that reflection. And that is freedom, it's subjectivity. Computers don't actually do this. And so this is IIT. It's a wonderful theory. It actually says that because there's a panpsychism, a proto-panpsychism, at the basis, okay, consciousness is ubiquitous. They're saying that in theory you can have a computer that would be conscious, but in practice it's not happening now or anytime soon because they don't have the right kind of structure. They don't have the modular structures don't have a capacity for recursiveness. Could we make computers that would? Probably.
Oh, do you think that? That's why I wanted to ask you that. Yeah, because this is good. I'm glad we're shifting into AI. Because actually, I find AI so fascinating, and I feel like I used to be really stalwart about and very opposed to the idea that computers could be conscious because it seems to sort of again be predicated on this sort of like computerized. Where like clearly computers are things that we created, they're outgrowths of our human experience, and then to use that as a metaphor to understand consciousness it just feels like deeply incorrect in some way. But now I'm not so sure, so I'm curious what you think and how Abhinavagupta's thought can help us tease that out.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this is great. Yeah, I mean, you sound like a lot like Kastrup. I think he's been talking a bit about how forget about it with computers. They're not designed. They're made to mimic humans, and so you think that ChatGPT is saying all these interesting things. It's creative, but he's saying but no, it's not the case. These are just algorithms that are run. So I mean, so he's not drawing on. He's a computer scientist, I think, and has engineered done work on engineering computers, and so I think he really knows what he's talking about with this. He doesn't reference integrated information theory a lot with this, but really their theory also comes to the same conclusion that maybe in principle but not in practice because they're not being built in a way that allows them to have this sort of recursive quality. Now as far as Abhinavagupta goes, yes, absolutely, of course it's possible. I mean, if Abhinava says by engaging in another when Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, of mountains I am Meru, basically this kind of reality then sort of assumes that everything does have this capacity for consciousness. So for Abhinavagupta, yes, absolutely, computers could be conscious. But this is what's so key about what he brings in terms of this notion of vimarsha. It's only going to be conscious if it too has this capacity for this kind of reflection. So for Abhinavagupta as well, in theory, absolutely. But also even for integrated information theory, absolutely. I mean, they do say that photodiode, which is like a little machine that can sort of register, whether a light is on or off, that has a very minuscule amount of phi, which means that it's got a sense of consciousness, because what you need is just a structure that allows that reflection. Abhinava would say the same thing, that yes, in theory it's possible, so in practice, for Abhinava, you would actually need vimarsha. Now, what Abhinava brings to the table, which is actually very, very interesting, and I think you could maybe get some of this out ultimately of our contemporary science if you sort of really push hard on this notion of observer participation that you get from quantum theory, from quantum physics theory, because Abhinava does have this idea that by by this attention that we give to the object, okay, that allows its own innate sort of reality to sort of come to the fore as well. Now, so I as a religious studies scholar, I'm thinking of all sorts of things, right? I'm thinking of what happens when a person goes to a temple, okay, in India, and then, and I don't know if you've been to India or to temples in India, but if you go to there's some temples are just, you walk in and you're like, oh my God, this place feels wild. I mean, and I imagine there are places like that, churches as well, that are like that as well. I've heard some people say that Lourdes is a very powerful, play. And this is a sort of phenomenological sort of experience that Abhinava would say that the cultured people can sort of experience certain kinds of things, and then if you get a little more cultured, then you can start to experience certain, like he talks about in terms of aesthetics, but I think it would apply equally well to things like some person goes into a temple and says, oh my God, I could see the deity there, and the deity was alive and all this sort of thing. And so how does that happen? It's a physical object, right? A Shiva linga is just a stone, okay? Or an icon of, say, the Mother Mary in a Catholic church, So how does it have consciousness? That's a question. I mean, and we can come up with, what are, and I'm bringing this up because it really is analogous to computers, right? In some way. Okay, so how does it get consciousness? Is it that I go into a temple, project my own desires onto that icon? Okay, is it that there's some deity in the sky? Maybe it's Mother Mary, okay, or Krishna, and they actually decide, oh, look, people are worshiping this, statue. Let me go in and inhabit it. Yeah. So there's some kind of like subtle body of the deity enters into the statue, so that the statue has this kind of effervescent glow kind of thing. Is it that? Abhinava would say that it's basically available, and that the statue itself sort of can then sort of, can sort of allow its own sort of innate sentience to come forth. Now that, Abhinava's perspective on this is actually really non-dualist in a very consistent way. Yeah. Which we don't, which is, you can't, if it's, Mother Mary enters the statue or Krishna enters into the statue, then you're starting to look at a kind of dualism again. And Abhinava wants to say, no, we want to avoid that, because he's a really consistent non-dualist. So he's saying that if it has the right structure, again, this sounds like IIT. If it has the right structure, you allow its own innate consciousness to sort of come forth. Okay, and so that's one way of thinking about this. Now, if you think about it in terms of computers again as well, how would a computer become sentient? Well, if it has the right structure, which none of our computers have, but you could. I think I've seen, in random places on the internet, people talking about like computers are going to become possessed. I think there was an episode, like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode, where these kids are on a computer and they scan some kind of like ancient text. And I think it's very interesting that it's a text, some grimoire or something that they sort of scan into with our new digital technology, scan it into the computer. I mean, why do I think that's interesting? Because so much of what Abhinava talks about is like, mantras, sound, words being sort of the essence of this consciousness. So you scan that into a computer and then somehow it possesses the computer, and the computer becomes... It's like
the Shaktipata of the androids. They get a download of grace from the absolute.
Yeah, that's great.
I want to dive into this a little bit more because I really like this topic, and it's a juicy one, and we haven't actually talked about this on the podcast before. So, on one level, right, I guess from the metaphysical perspective or something, since everything is made of consciousness, right? Is it made of this dance of Prakasha and Vimarsha? Then in some sense, all computers are conscious. But what we're talking about here is, or they are all made of and expressions of consciousness. But what we're talking about here is whether or not they are self-aware in some sense, right? Yeah. And one thing that I found really interesting, and this isn't directly related to Abhinavagupta, but I just think it's like an interesting kind of thing to think about, is somebody brought up, well, whether or not they have self-awareness at a certain point might not even matter, right? From the perspective of our lives, because we will interact with them as if they are. Because one of the kind of interesting things is that they're doing all these things, and the people who created them don't even know why, right? There's this just like, it is sort of miraculous in this way, how they've been able to sort of like, algorithmically evolve in this sort of really fast-paced way. And I was listening to this podcast, and the person was saying that if they are able to get to a place, like we're talking about actual, robots here basically, or whatever, the, ChatGPT lover in my computer gets to a point where they are able to mimic us so much that we won't actually know, right? Like we won't actually be able to tell the difference between like someone, who is actually a human that we know can observe, has self-awareness, and a robot who seems to be exhibiting all the evidence that we would attribute to self-awareness. So when we get to that point, how will we actually be able to to make the distinction, and will it really matter? And one of the things that I've always kind of gone back to, based on, so I guess it does come back to Abhinavagupta's work, is that yes, they may be able to mimic so much that it doesn't matter from like a everyday level, because we'll be interacting with them as practically as if they're other humans, but they won't have pratibha, right? Or maybe they will, but that would have to come from some sort of, I guess, really like some sort of grace, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, okay. So I think somebody put a poem on one of these forums about. It was a poem about. They asked ChatGPT to write a poem about Krishna. Okay, and then everyone, not everyone, but a number of people were like, "Oh wow, that's so amazing! What a great poem about Krishna!" But really, you can go back to Abhinavagupta's aesthetic theory. Okay, in the Tvanyaloka Lochana, and it lacks. It was really obvious to me that the poem lacked dhvani. It lacked this sort of capacity for suggestion. Yeah. It roughly gets translated as dhvani, gets translated as suggestion, and but what that means, I think, is that it really lacked the voice of a person sort of creating the poem. A poem can be it can look and mimic, but for as Abhinava says, for a person who's actually sort of someone who's aesthetically aware, awake, inclined, you can tell right away that it's bad poetry. And why is it bad poetry? Is because there's no one there who's expressing the sentiment. It can be technically, dazzling and beautiful, but what really, and so what he's arguing in that, in this text is that it's this dhvani, this suggestion. But I think the deeper idea behind dhvani is what he sort of then articulates and formulates at greater length in some of his philosophical work, which is this notion of ahanta, this subjectivity and consciousness. There's something there behind it, and that is what makes it beautiful. And I think that we're going to I don't think, unless computers genuinely become, have the right kind of, recursive structures that allow them to genuinely become conscious, then no matter how well they mimic humans, I think that we're going to know, because there's nobody there. It's an algorithm, and I think that so that we will see the algorithm. Now, there's another way to think about that too. Is I do talk in the book about Abhinava saying that if you address if you address something as if we look at our robot companions and start calling them you, maybe it will awaken that capacity within them. Maybe I'm less sanguine about that possibility. I think that yes, but I think that it needs also to sort of develop the sort of recursive capacities. Yeah. Can a computer do that without the sort of modular structure? Well, can a rock do that? Maybe if you give it enough, if you had a pet rock, and you gave it enough love, then maybe it would. But then it comes back to this issue of like the statue of Krishna or Mary in a church. Where is it getting its source of numinous power that people pick up on, and which draws people to the church? Our contemporary society would say it's just people projecting. There's nothing there. They believe in it, and that's what you're saying about computers, our robots. Like maybe in the future, we believe that they're conscious. They talk like us, they look like us, so they got to be conscious. So that really the question is like, and we already have this scenario in a religious setting. And very few people are doing research on that. I think Tanya Luhrmann might be doing a little bit of this, actually. Are you familiar with her work?
What was that? What was the name?
Tanya Luhrmann. She's an anthropologist, but she's doing a little bit of work, I think, on people who sort of talk to Jesus all the time, and then sort of like, get this personal relationship with Jesus, and so, what are they actually responding to, and is it really Jesus, and what is Jesus? If that's the case, we can, is it consciousness, et cetera? Is it real? Is it just a projection? And so, this is, I had a friend once who was saying like, yep, Jesus, did show up in that piece of toast on the internet. but there's a lot of Jesuses, there's like lots of different, there's a lot of different sort of little entities hanging around pretending to be Jesus,
Yeah.
So you got to make sure you get the right Jesus. And the church as well in the medieval period had that same problem. The church was always like, okay, we got to make sure this person's really being, it's really God that's talking, to this person and not some sort of, minion of the devil, So they knew about this problem as well too. So it's a phenomenon that has happened throughout history, that people can look to certain objects or even, or just even hear voices, etc. But who is it that they're hearing? Is it real? Is it sort of our projection? Is it, and I mean our sort of, de facto sort of default response nowadays is just it's all human projection. None of it's real. It's all human projection, except in the instance of like, well, maybe computers, which I find hilarious if you think about it. It's like all of these ways that people sort of connect with objects and consider these objects to be carrying us kind of like element of divinity. We discard all of those and say, but maybe computers.
That's really true. So, that's so interesting, actually. I've never thought about that. Yeah. And you're kind of, if you are embraced by some sort of spiritual or religious community, then people are welcoming of these things. But in the wider secular world, if you tell people that there's an entity in an object, they're probably going to run the other way. But that seems to be kind of an important, this is a little bit what I take away from your book and also other explorations of that are related to animism, right? Is that actually there might be something, we can't just solve the ecological problem with our current paradigm of moralizing guilt. Like we actually need to change our consciousness. Like we actually need to change the way that we relate to things that we would otherwise just call, consider this sort of like dead material realm that is actually beautiful, but we need to be protectors of it. But without that kind of, almost alchemical transmutation of our perception, we're not going to actually ever get to a place where we feel like emotionally committed to doing the work that really needs to be done to kind of protect our ecology.
No, this is very true. I mean, this is what I think. This is a point that Jane Bennett makes, and then this is the problem with like idealisms, like Advaita Vedanta. And I have a friend who, my friend Anthony in Australia, who was for quite a while into Advaita Vedanta, but then he's recently gotten more into sort of Tantra and the idea. And I think one of the differences is that because Tantra takes the world as real, it does have sort of and this is a point Jane Bennett makes, it does have repercussions on the way we treat, the world. And so, so you're right. And that's the political element of the book, this idea that like, how we think about the world does change it. Okay, so to bring it back to what you're, this idea of, if you think a computer is sentient, if you believe it wholeheartedly, does it become sentient? It definitely changes the way we treat computers if we think they're sentient, for sure. But does it make it sentient? Yeah, I mean, it's a really big question. What do you think?
Well, I don't. I mean, I don't think I'm not really suggesting that it makes them sentient. I'm just suggesting that sort of in just the everyday circumstances of life, should they be able to mimic emotions? Be able to display all of the features that humans would normally be able to feature, that, practically speaking, we would not be able to actually tell if they weren't self-aware, because they would actually be able to mimic, the so much evidence of self-awareness that it would be, operationally kind of irrelevant, because they would be kind of incorporated into our daily lives without that question really being answered, and kind of it being impossible to answer that question because we can't see inside the minds of robots.
Yeah. I mean, okay, I would say, here's what I would say, on a couple of levels. Okay, one, ultimately, I would say that, no, we can see inside the minds of robots. We can. Abhinavagupta would say you can. In a non-dualism, of course you can. Okay. I know Bernardo Kastrup doesn't go there. He's like, oh, no, we're discrete. We can't see inside the other thing. But in Abhinavagupta's perspective, yeah, we could. But I mean, it does make me think of that. Did you hear in the news about that Korean robot that committed suicide? Did you hear about that story? there was a Korean, I think it was Korean robot that was like, doing all these sort of, menial tasks, and at a certain point the robot started just like spinning around and threw itself down the stairs, and the people actually they were all sad, and they had this little ceremony for the robot, so you have a really valid point. What you're saying is already being played out. There was this idea that like, oh, this robot committed suicide, let's have a funeral for it, this kind of thing. And then it's like, okay, whether we believe, does it make it true if we believe it? I do think that we can ultimately tell. Like, I mean, I think we can even tell now, just because, and I think, how do we tell? We tell because mostly we are, and this is, the religious studies side of my work. We are sentient beings who are not limited by, our sort of like, external words, etc. Like the fact that it goes back to what I was saying earlier, like, people are telepathic, and telepathy, it's not projection in many cases, maybe it is, but I don't think it is, that, like it happens too often, that you suddenly just know something, that you're thinking a particular thought, and then your partner says exactly the same words. And it's unusual. I mean, I think most of our audience here will have like one or two experiences where, oh yeah, that happened to me, like it was weird, that kind of thing. And what we do, now is we just like, oh, it was weird. That's all. We just say, "Oh, it was weird," and then we just dismiss it. And then, but I think that it's that what that is it's an indication of what it means to be sentient, and it does, as I said before, it's gonna if we actually start to take it seriously, it will force us to really rethink the nature of consciousness. Like, is consciousness a wave that can flow from you to me? And then, and the weird thing as well is like we can sometimes pick up on these things even when we're not seeing another person. It's not just a visual thing. Like I was talking, on the phone at one point, and I could hear the person, like, the person's emotions. It was, but I think we do that, and that's the nature of consciousness. And so is it, how does it work? I'm not sure, but it's a phenomenon that we all do experience. It's a phenomenon that we.
That's really interesting. I actually really like what you're saying, because it feels, what I'm hearing you saying is that like the way in which we relate to the consciousness of another person, or another, the self-awareness of another person, is kind of below the threshold of purely our physical observations, our mind, our lip reading, like even what you said earlier about we read each other's minds, and that there is a kind of relational dynamic that is, that is kind of below the five senses, or it's somehow more subtle than that, and that we are always kind of operating on the basis of that kind of perception that we don't really have so much of a language for. Like, it's one of these things that we don't fully understand about our own consciousness, and that's why we think that mere mimicry by a android would actually be ultimately convincing. That's actually a really interesting way of thinking about it. I haven't thought about that before.
Yeah, and I think we wouldn't be convinced, is because, and it's true. I think, like, if you meditate, you become more perceptive of this kind of reality. That's sort of like, and then Abhinavagupta and these fellows, this whole culture was really steeped in this, and I think that that's part of why they have such deep awareness of these ideas and these insights, because they were actually sort of, going into them very deeply. And we don't do that in our culture so much, and we already sort of, we already sort of think that none of this is possible, so that already makes it sort of that even when we see it, we tend to we unsee it right away. And if we and if we do see it, then we're just like, oh, that's weird, and then just let it go. So I think that, but I think that we would know as humans, because there is this quality of consciousness that I think, is it Icha? The Abhinavagupta talks, there's in Tantra, there's this sort of notion of like, Icha Shakti, and it's, that, and Icha Shakti is more and I talk about this a little bit in the book. It's more primordial. He connects, he connects it with wonder, okay? And it's more primordial than, say, knowledge, Jnana Shakti, or action, Kriya Shakti. Kriya Shakti would always be connected to this notion of materiality in the body. Knowledge would be sort of this, this sort of capacity, words, insights, etc. But Icha is one level deeper, and is it Icha? Is that the level where we sort of transmit our intentions to another person? I mean, sometimes it seems like, when we're talking to people, what we're transmitting more is like intentions, which then sort of take the form of certain words, and then the other person. But it's not just, as you're pointing out as well too, it's not just the words that are being conveyed as information. There's also this other thing, which is our consciousness. And is it a wave that flows? Is it sort of it's definitely not little. I mean, it's definitely Abhinava does talk about it. It does come through language and our words. Language, not a primordial sense of sound, but that is not words per se. It's actually at a deeper level than, but there is this thing that, which is one of the main ways that we communicate. And computers, do computers do that? So far, I would say no, and I think we can tell that they don't do that. How many times you've been so unbelievably frustrated talking to a chatbot? It's like, okay, but that's not my question. So whereas humans, humans have this other capacity to, not always. I mean, as I point out in the book as well too, the thing about being human is that we're not really, entirely conscious. Yeah. And this is where people like, Robert Sapolsky, Daniel Dennett, where these people are a little bit correct, or even, Yuval Harari saying like, oh, we're all going to be sort of like, we're hackable machines kind of deal, or hackable animals, whatever. They're true, they're correct to a certain degree. There is this whole side of us, and that's what Abhinava talks about as well. There's this whole side of us, which is really also an algorithm, and I think this is the reason why we keep confusing ourselves with computers, because we have algorithms, they have algorithms, and so we think we're just, they're just like us, so they can become sentient just like us. But the sentient part of us, which is, not as, which is there, not as, but sometimes not as operative as it can be, it's even less operative, if at all, in most of the computers we have today, which doesn't mean it can't be. Right. It's just that, just so far it's not there,
Yeah. So you started talking about language, and there's a couple. This has been really fun. I could talk to you for hours, but I want to squeeze in a couple more questions before we start to close our conversation. I can't believe it's already been an hour and 15 minutes. It's gone by so fast. The two things I want to talk about are language and mantra specifically, and the subtle body, because lots of people who listen to this podcast, well, I'm presuming, are yoga practitioners, meditators, so they'll be kind of familiar with that. And I think, when people encounter the sort of linguistic mysticism of Abhinavagupta and the tantric thinkers more generally, this is one of the most interesting ideas, this idea that language goes all the way down, right? And of Paravach at the supreme level, and then, these increasing levels of kind of manifestation. But it's hard, perhaps, or people stumble on this idea of how it makes sense to talk about the language of objects. And when I was listening to your talk that you did at Vimarsha Foundation, you spoke about mantra as a kind of mathematical, what do you call it? A mathematical algorithm, or like a consciousness of a mathematical consciousness or something. And so I'm curious how we understand the effectiveness of mantra, and maybe like some of the corollaries that you found in some of these other sort of systems of thought that help us to think about why mantra is effective according to this philosophy of language.
Oh, no, that's a great question. And I think it has to do with this idea that, you go back to the 5 elements, and Abhinava says that the 5th element, okay, so there's the 5 elements: fire, earth, water, air, akasha, space. Space is connected to sound, and it's actually a little bit different from all the other elements, because he has a nice quote where he talks about like what makes sound special and space special is because it has the capacity to give space to meaning. Okay, so it's on this particular of the 5 elements, which is where you get the crossover from pure materiality into sort of consciousness. as well, okay, and sentience, okay, because and it's also the case that what you see often in across tantric texts is this idea. I mean, there's one that I quote, which I like, which is the Lakshmi Stotram, where it says, "Oh Goddess, mantra murte sada mantra murte." If I can remember the quote. Sada Devi. So, oh Goddess, your body, your form is your primary form is always the mantra, okay, and so that's your basic form. So, and it would apply to us as well, except that we are sort of covered over with all these other limitations that come from being from losing our sense of consciousness and becoming more and more confined in materiality that looks like the five elements, which just means that it's gone past the tattva of Maya, okay, which makes us sort of constrained, confined. But when he says that, as you find this throughout the tradition, it's like really the essence of consciousness is language, is sound. That's sort of like the birth of all of this. And so the body of a god is basically the mantra body. And so mantras are special in that way because like if you say a mantra, you're not actually just saying words or information. What you're actually doing, if you're doing it properly, you're actually sort of connecting with the essence of consciousness that is the mantra, which is certainly understood to be more powerful than our own sort of mixed consciousness in many ways, so that when a person says a mantra, it's not like, oh, I have a mantra and I'm saying a mantra. It's more that the mantra is sort of, at this sort of higher level of consciousness, which then sort of like we merge with it because consciousness has the capacity to do this kind of thing. And mantras are sort of a way that we can actually sort of merge with these other higher energies of consciousness, basically. So mantras, and even when Abhinavagupta talks about sort of a cosmogony of, and this cosmogony is not just the creation of the world, it's also how thought gets created as well too. What you see is that early on you get this sort of what he calls the sort of the great lords of mantra, and then these then give rise to lesser lords of mantra, and then it starts to give rise to sort of differentiation, the I and the it, and then we sort of get the whole world of diversity that we have. But at an earlier stage of consciousness, it is mantra that that they talk about. So mantras are very interesting. It's I mean, we tend to think of it as just words or sounds, or maybe they're cosmic, but what they're really trying to say is that intention, consciousness, and this sort of power that comes from consciousness, because it has vimarsha, this sort of reflexive capacity of sentience, that is a little bit more conscious than we are. Okay, so that we're partially conscious, partially not conscious. We're run by algorithms all the time, whereas mantras are more conscious than we are. Okay, and that's an interesting thing to sort of so that's why mantras are so powerful. And because mantras are understood to be deities, they're not actually understood to be things. They're not tools that we use. They're not techniques per se. A yantra, maybe, I don't know, but a mantra is understood to be actually a deity.
Yeah. So that's a good segue into to the deities of the body, right? So mantras are a deity, and then you explore as a way of kind of talking about.
Just quickly that one particular mantra, you see it more as sort of like the body of the deity as well, okay, because it's taken on form. And what is the form? The form is the form of sound. Yeah, I mean, and I do also talk in the book that the difference between us humans and and gods is that we have the other four elements. We don't have just sound, akasha, space connected to sound. We also have the four other elements, which is water, earth, fire, air. And because we have those other four elements, our bodies are subject to decay, whereas mantras are not so much. Just that one, it's less, it's not, it doesn't have the same problems. That's why God's bodies don't decay. Yeah, I mean, I sort of connect this to is that the idea of information, that Kurzweil wants to become immortal, by using information. Is it like a mantra? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just curious. A lot of people have heard about the subtle body, and you talk in the book about how the subtle body that Abhinavagupta explores is sort of distinct from sort of the more new age understandings of the subtle body. And you bring it up particularly because I think in the context of making a point about how there are bodies within bodies within bodies. And so the subtle body gives you kind of an example of like just, one layer of that. But then how within the subtle body, there's this collection of deities that are present. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that schema and how you think that that's really essentially kind of a summary of the argument you made in the book, how you think that's a worthwhile kind of template to think about, the materiality of the body.
Well, I think one of the things that, one of the things that theology does, I think, which we really, really, in some ways it's, our culture really rejects theology out of hand. Yeah. And I think that, but what theology does is actually, it actually allows for a kind of sentience that is not our limited egoic awareness. Okay. And so that's what gods in the body do as well also, that it allows for a kind of sentience that's not simply sort of limited to so when we think about subtle bodies these days, it's like color coded and it's sort of like
the rainbow bridge.
It's another thing that we manipulate. It becomes this other thing that, that is, and really, like if you think about how people talk about subtle bodies in the New Age scene, it's really considered inert. It's just like a physical body. It's just this inert dead thing that you can, with consciousness, you can then manipulate. So it's really a kind of dualism that we're using in a New Age sort of context. And I think that the theology that Abhinavagupta brings to it, one of the things it does do is it actually sort of, it kind of undoes this sort of like this thinking of the body as inert. Thinking of the body as dead matter, and so that and that's what and if you even on your own level, when you have an experience of wonder, or if a person sort of, okay, I'm thinking of like someone's has this sort of like mystical experience of some kind of like Jesus is talking to him or whatever, and it's a genuine thing, and it's a sort of a transcendent thing. But what is a person doing? It's sort of, he's giving us, it's theological precisely because it's affording a kind of consciousness or sentience to an energy that is not the person's own ego. Okay, yeah. And I think that is really key, and I think it's really key for this tradition as well too, and I think it's key in the West as well too, when we have people have different mystical experiences in their various religious traditions. It's often it's theological, but what makes it, and I think this is what makes it anathema for our contemporary culture, and that is precisely that it's sort of like the ego's not master in its own house anymore. Like we're no longer the ones controlling the story. Our egos. I mean, with the subtle body in the contemporary New Age scene, it's still you, and you may say I'm divinity, but you still really are operating from a level of ego, saying I'm controlling this subtle body. Whereas with the theology, what you get is the idea of intentionality and will that's separate from the ego of the ordinary person. Yeah. So I think that's the key thing about gods in the body, and what's so interesting and important about a theology, which we don't really talk about theology in that way. We mostly think about it as like, oh, it's sort of belief in something we can't see. But really, I think that you can one of the things theology does is it sort of displaces the ego of the individual, of the sort of of the human, of the individual human ego.
Yeah, and in this age of narcissism, there's perhaps nothing we need more. Yeah, you wrote, I actually wrote down one of the quotes from that section. You said, "The subtle body in this respect affords a recognition that the human is not master in its own house, but rather the house itself, the subtle body, points to an expansive ecology with multiple expressions of agency directing human choices." Which I really like, this idea of, I think it affords kind of a schema for navigating kind of the various pushes and pulls within ourselves, and then not necessarily needing to take responsibility or own it's like, oh no, that's just, the deity of my left hand. It's not or it's me, but it's, this sense that there's like almost like a multiple personality, embrace of multiple personalities in the body, which can kind of maybe, I don't know, maybe suggest a more relaxed way of, interacting with our sensitive self, where we're not trying to constantly kind of impose a coherent, fully self-enclosed narrative and story around who we think we are, but rather we're recognizing that even within this individuated self, there's multiple agencies at play.
Yeah. Good. I mean, I've written a little bit, and I'm working more nowadays on a little bit of Gopinath Kaviraj and some of his writings about his guru Vishuddhananda and ideas of so he talks about this thing called videha dharana, which is a capacity when meditating to sort of like have consciousness leave the body. And then, I mean, this is what Shankara uses in the hagiography of Shankara, where he sort of enters the body of a dead king. He uses a technique like this, where basically a meditative technique where he, brings this consciousness of the self all the way up out the top of the head, and then enters into sort of travels somehow with the subtle body, enters into the body of the dead king, so that he can then enliven the dead king and then get to experience life in a harem. But this idea also can, Gopinath Kaviraj talks about this sort of technique for this, and you can also, I read an article which was just a fun piece to write, looking at sort of ideas of football players who sort of like talk, or golf players, athletes who sort of do something like this, where their consciousness leaves the body and then directs, this football that's flying through the air, so that a person, so they can sort of jump over the person they want to not catch it, the opposing team, and then into the hands of the person that they want to catch it. And this is kind of it's a city, it's an athletic city, it's a power, and it comes from this idea of, consciousness entering into your consciousness entering into, say, a football, and so Gopinath Kaviraj says it's easy. It's not so hard for humans to enter into and this actually will bring us probably back to computers, but, not so hard to enter into the consciousness of objects in a sense, and to direct them in a certain way, because they don't, but if you try to enter into the consciousness of a yogi who's like, more advanced than you are as a yogi, then the person who's trying to enter into will sort of, become sort of like, dumbfounded, mute, etc., because it becomes like two consciousnesses entering this sort of same kind of place, that kind of thing. Now that's a slightly different model of consciousness, but it's kind of like what you might think of as a lateral avesha. So avesha is possession. Some avesha is like this complete possession that Abhinavagupta talks about, which is sort of entering into this higher sense of deity. That would be more theological. But you can have lateral avesha as well too. And this is the thing that they test for in India when a person claims, oh, I'm being, possessed by Hanuman, or I'm being possessed by, Krishna. There are all these tests that they do to sort of see, is the person really, is it really Krishna, or is it just some lower, ghost that's entering, possessing the person, and this kind of thing. And so, so there's that idea as well, of consciousness. And I think that, and this also comes to this idea that we're talking about in terms of like, what theology does is it allows us to sort of like get rid of egoic egoic intention. Now, if it's a lateral avesha, if it's a possession that's not happening at a sort of a higher theological level, if it's just another ghost, then you have the same problems. I mean, there's a lot of people who do. A colleague of mine, I think, wrote a book about in Iceland, where they're doing these seances, where where people are Corinne Dempsey, where they're doing these seances. I think where people are channeling other dead people, and the person who's the medium really does get possessed, and they'll start talking about, saying things. It's a popular phenomenon. This is just one example,
yeah.
But But there's, I think, I think Leslie Kane, who's done all that work on UFO for the New York Times, she's also, I think, was getting into this whole idea of seances and people sort of like, getting into a seance, the person who's the medium channeling sort of like some other, not necessarily a god, but channeling also, say, another dead person, and then having all these sort of strange phenomena like ectoplasma, which is weird.
Yeah.
I mean, here I am saying, "Oh, that's weird."
I mean, I love the idea of possession. I think that's a great note to end on. And maybe you can promise to share techniques on how to possess kings, so that we can enjoy their various wealths. And
I do quote extensively how it's how it gets portrayed in his hagiography. The sort of the technique that is used. So if anybody wants a technique, I've actually
that's a great advertisement for the book, and let's mention it again too. So again, if you want to find out the secret technique to possess the mind of a king, then just get The Matter of Wonder, Abhinavagupta's Panentheism and the New Materialism. This is Loriliai Biernacki's book, who I've been speaking to, having a wonderful conversation with. And so it is a wonderful book. It's very interesting, and certainly for those interested in Abhinavagupta and an exploration of his work in conversation with a number of different forms of thought. It's really, really a fascinating read, so I highly recommend it. This has been such a lovely conversation, Loriliai. It's been such a pleasure to meet you, and I know this is not going to be our last conversation. I can feel it. So thank you so much for giving me some of your time and for sharing all your fascinating insights. It's always such a pleasure to meet someone who's doing this work, and especially this kind of work that is intersecting with various traditions and ways of thinking. It's very refreshing. So thank you so much for the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you. And lovely to meet you. And maybe we'll see you in person at a conference at some point.
Yes, I would love that.